There is a moment that most people over 50 can identify even if they never talk about it. The moment you realize the world had stopped looking at you. Not in a dramatic way, not with hostility or contempt. Worse than that, with nothing. You walked into a room and the energy did not shift. You stood at a counter and the person behind it looked past you. You offered an opinion in a meeting and watched it dissolve into the air as though the words had no weight. You existed in the same spaces you had always existed in, but something in the way those spaces received you had changed. And the change was not loud enough to protest. It was just quiet enough to make you wonder whether it was real or whether you were imagining it. You were not imagining it. The world does become less attentive to people after a certain age. Not all at once. Not to everyone in the same way. But the pattern is consistent enough that millions of people experience it, and almost none of them hear it named. The slow, steady withdrawal of social visibility that begins somewhere around 50 and deepens with each passing year. The gradual sensation of occupying less space in the awareness of others, of becoming furniture in rooms where you used to be a presence, of watching the world continue at full speed while your place inside it quietly shrinks. This is not vanity. This is not the complaint of someone who misses being young and beautiful. This is a psychological experience with real neurological consequences, and understanding it requires looking not at the surface of what is happening, but at what visibility actually provides the human nervous system and what it costs a person when that provision is withdrawn. To understand why becoming invisible after 50 is psychologically significant, you have to understand what visibility does for the brain. Because being seen is not a luxury. It is a regulatory mechanism. One that operates so continuously and so quietly that most people do not notice it until it stops. From infancy onward, the human nervous system is calibrated by the attention of others. A baby who is looked at, responded to, and mirrored learns that they exist, that they matter, that they have an effect on the world around them. This is not metaphorical. It is neurological. The brain uses the responses of others as confirmation that the self is real, that it has substance, that it occupies a position in the social landscape that others can detect and respond to. And this need for external confirmation does not disappear with age. It evolves. It becomes less desperate, less consuming, less central to survival. But it never fully goes away. At every stage of life, the nervous system is quietly tracking whether it is being registered by the people around it. And when that registration begins to fade, the system notices. What happens inside the nervous system when visibility declines is subtle but pervasive. The brain begins to receive fewer social signals, fewer smiles directed your way, fewer moments of eye contact, fewer instances of being sought out, consulted, or included in the spontaneous flow of social attention. Each of these micro-events individually means nothing. But collectively, they form a data stream that the brain uses to calculate something fundamental. How much do I matter here? And when that data stream thins, when the signals become less frequent and less intense, the brain does not process it as a neutral change. It processes it as a loss, a quiet, ongoing, incremental loss of social significance that registers in the same neural circuits that process rejection, exclusion, and grief. This is why becoming invisible feels the way it does. Not like anger, not like outrage, like a slow leak, a deflation so gradual that by the time you notice it, you are not sure how long it has been happening, or how much has already been lost. And the experience is made worse by its ambiguity, because unlike other forms of loss, invisibility is almost impossible to prove. You cannot point to a single moment and say there, that is when it happened. There is no rejection letter, no termination notice, no conversation where someone sits you down and explains that you will be receiving less attention from now on. The withdrawal is ambient. It lives in the things that do not happen rather than the things that do. The phone calls that are not made, the invitations that are not extended, the glances that do not land. And because it is defined by absence rather than action, it resists being named. You cannot complain about something that did not happen. You cannot grieve a loss that no one else can see. So you carry it quietly, and you begin to wonder whether the problem is the world or whether it is you. The invisibility does not arrive from one direction. It arrives from everywhere at once, and each direction carries its own particular sting. In the workplace, it often begins with relevance. The ideas that used to carry weight are now received politely but not pursued. The institutional knowledge that took decades to build is treated as background noise rather than strategic advantage. Younger colleagues are promoted past you not because they are more competent, but because the system has unconsciously decided that the future belongs to them and the past belongs to you. You are not pushed out. You are simply no longer pulled in. The invitations to the important meetings thin. The requests for your opinion become less frequent. And one day you realize that the organization you gave decades to has already begun imagining itself without you. Not with malice. With the quiet, mechanical indifference of a system that has decided you are no longer central to its story. In social spaces, the invisibility takes a different form. Conversations that used to include you now flow around you. Groups form and reform, and you find yourself standing at the edges more often than you used to. The energy of a room, which once responded to your entrance, no longer shifts when you arrive. You are present but unregistered, included but not engaged. And the experience is disorienting because nothing has changed about you. Your mind is the same. Your humor is the same. Your capacity for connection is the same. What changed is the lens through which the world perceives you. And that lens, shaped by a culture that associates youth with relevance and age with decline, has quietly adjusted its focus to look past you. In the most intimate spaces, the invisibility can be the most painful of all. The partner who once looked at you with a specific kind of attention now looks at you with familiarity, not coldness. Familiarity, which is its own form of not seeing. The children who once needed you desperately have built lives that function without your daily involvement. The friends who once sought your company now have their own demands, their own diminishing energy, their own slow retreat into the smaller circles that age naturally produces. You are not unloved, but you are no longer needed in the way that once gave your days their architecture. And the difference between being loved and being needed, which once seemed semantic, now feels like the difference between being remembered and being present. And there is a gendered dimension to this that deserves to be named, even though it is uncomfortable to say. For women, the invisibility after 50 often arrives with a particular cruelty. A culture that spent decades evaluating them through the lens of appearance, fertility, and desirability withdraws its gaze at precisely the moment when many women are arriving at their most powerful, most articulate, most fully realized selves. The message is specific and devastating. Your value was always conditional on something that time was going to take. And now that time has taken it, the world has less use for your presence. For men, the invisibility often tracks professional relevance, the loss of title, authority, and the social identity that work provided. Either way, the pattern is the same. The world valued something external. Time changed that external thing. and the person underneath, who was always more than what the world was measuring, is left holding a fullness that no one is asking to see. There is a psychological term for what happens inside a person who is becoming invisible. It is called social devaluation, and its effects are not limited to feelings. They restructure how the brain operates. When a person consistently receives fewer signals of social relevance, the brain begins to adjust its expectations downward. It stops anticipating recognition. It lowers its threshold for what counts as sufficient social input. It begins to treat invisibility as the new baseline. And this adjustment, while adaptive in one sense, carries a hidden cost. Because when the brain stops expecting to be seen, it also begins to invest less in the behaviors that make a person visible. The person speaks less. They offer their opinion less readily. They initiate fewer conversations. They take up less space, not because they have chosen to withdraw, because the system has quietly recalibrated itself to match the environment it is receiving. This creates a feedback loop that is difficult to interrupt. The less visible you are, the less you invest in being visible. And the less you invest, the more invisible you become. Over time, this loop can produce a state that looks from the outside like contentment or acceptance, but feels from the inside like something closer to resignation. A quiet surrender to the idea that the world has moved on, and your job now is to take up as little space as possible while it does. And the cruelest dimension of this feedback loop is that it is reinforced by the culture. The messages aimed at people over 50 are almost uniformly about graceful aging, about accepting change, about letting go, about gratitude for what you had, rather than insistence on what you still deserve. And while these messages are not wrong in principle, they can function as permission to stop fighting for your own visibility, to stop insisting on your relevance, to mistake the world's withdrawal of attention for a natural and healthy transition, when it is, in many cases, a social injury that deserves to be named rather than accepted. But here is what the invisibility does not account for: the person inside it. Because the external world may have decided that you are less relevant. The culture may have shifted its attention to younger voices, faster bodies, newer ideas. The social landscape may have quietly reorganized itself around people who are not you. But none of that changes what is happening inside. And what is happening inside is often the opposite of what the world assumes. After 50, the internal life does not decline. It concentrates. Decades of experience have compressed into a form of perception that is sharper, more discerning, and more layered than anything the younger mind could produce. The person who is being overlooked in the meeting is often the person who sees the flaw in the plan that everyone else is too excited to notice. The person who is being talked past at dinner is often the one holding the most nuanced understanding of what is actually being discussed. The person standing at the edge of the room is not there because they have nothing to contribute. They are there because the room stopped asking. This is the tragedy of invisibility after 50. It does not happen to people who have become less. It happens to people who have become more experienced, more discerning, more capable of depth, more able to see the whole picture rather than just the piece that is currently trending, more patient with complexity, more comfortable with ambiguity, more willing to sit with a problem long enough to find the real answer, rather than the fast one. The world withdraws its attention at precisely the moment when the person has the most to offer. And that mismatch between the richness of what lives inside and the poverty of what is reflected back is one of the most quietly devastating psychological experiences of the second half of life. There is a passage through invisibility that not everyone finds, But that changes everything for those who do. It begins with a question that the visible years never forced you to ask. If the world is no longer going to see me, can I learn to see myself? This is not a comforting platitude. It is a genuine psychological reorganization. For decades, the sense of self was partially maintained by external reflection, by being needed, by being consulted, by being looked at and responded to. When that reflection fades, the self has two options. It can shrink to match the diminished reflection, or it can learn, perhaps for the first time, to generate its own confirmation. This second option is harder. It requires the person to do something they may have never been asked to do before, to derive their sense of significance not from what the world returns to them, but from what they know to be true about themselves, independent of the world's attention. To sit with the knowledge that they are wise without anyone asking for their wisdom, that they are valuable without anyone measuring their value, that they are present, fully and completely whether or not anyone in the room registers that presence. This is not easy, and it is not instant. It requires grieving the old source of confirmation before the new one can take its place. It requires sitting with the discomfort of being unwitnessed long enough to discover that the witness was never what made the experience real. It was just what made it shared, and the experience itself, the depth, the perception, the quiet accumulation of a life fully lived, does not require sharing to exist. It only requires the person who carries it to stop doubting that it counts. And this grieving is real. It is not self-indulgent. It is not vanity dressed up as psychology. It is the legitimate mourning of a social position that provided something the nervous system relied on for decades. The warmth of being acknowledged, the energy of being engaged with, the simple daily confirmation that your existence registers in the awareness of others. Losing that is a loss, and treating it as anything less than a loss, dismissing it as superficial, or calling it a failure to age gracefully, only compounds the injury by denying the person the right to feel what is actually happening to them. The people who make this passage do not become louder. They do not fight for the attention the world has withdrawn. They do something more radical than that. They stop organizing their sense of self around the world's gaze entirely. And in that release, something opens, a solidity that does not depend on being noticed, a presence that does not need the room to confirm it, a sense of self that was always there, but that was obscured by the noise of being seen and the pain of being unseen. This does not mean the invisibility stops hurting. It does not mean the moments of being overlooked or talked past no longer sting. It means the sting no longer defines them. They carry it, they feel it, and they set it down. Because the self they have rebuilt on the other side of visibility is no longer a self that depends on the world's attention to know its own shape. It knows its shape from the inside. And that knowing, once it takes root, is steadier than anything the visible years ever provided, because it cannot be taken by time. It cannot be withdrawn by a culture that has looked away. It exists independent of the room, and it will continue to exist long after the room has moved on to whatever it has decided to look at next. This is not a story about fading gracefully. It is a story about what happens when the world stops looking and you are left with the question of whether you can still see yourself clearly. That question is not easy. But for those who stay with it long enough to find the answer is almost always the same. I am still here. I have always been here. And the fact that the room does not notice does not change a single thing about what I carry. If you have felt this, if you have walked into a room and sensed that the world had quietly adjusted its lens away from you, You are not imagining it, and you are not diminished by it. The invisibility is real. The pain of it is real, and neither of those things defines what you are worth. They only define what the world is currently able to see. And the world, as you have learned by now, has never been particularly good at seeing what matters most. It sees what moves fast. It sees what is new. It has never known how to look steadily at what is deep. That is not your failure. It is the world's limitation, and you are under no obligation to shrink yourself to match it. If this describes something you have been carrying without language, you are not alone. This channel is a space for the experiences that shape us deeply, but rarely get named. If this meant something to you, consider subscribing so these conversations continue to find you. And if you are willing, leave something in the comments, because the person the world stops seeing still has things to say, and this is a place where they will always be heard. Thank you for watching.